if you ever considered combining the harsh, blistered wasteland of Mad Max or Fallout with the gladiatorial exploits of Spartacus and a dash of fantasy monsters, elves, and magic, then congratulations, you just reinvented Dark Sun, the celebrated advanced Dungeons & Dragons setting that has since fallen into obscurity. In the 1980s and early 90s, some of the most brutal and engaging D&D licensed games hit the computers and consoles. Among these were games like Pool of Radiance, Eye of the Beholder, and other so-called gold box games, noted for their cover design. These were the brainchildren of Strategic Simulations Incorporated, SSI, one of the oldest and most prolific strategy game devs, who also dabbled in RPGs, making games for the Apple II and MS-DOS as early as 1980. On average, they launched nearly one title a month for over 20 years. But as we entered the 90s, TSR, the original creators of D&D, took a break from the popular settings of Forgotten Realms, Ravenloft, and Dragonlance to a fresh new take on fantasy role-playing. And today, I'd like to discuss this fantastic universe and the classic and now obscure computer games it inspired. Let's venture into the treacherous wasteland of Dark Sun. TSR released the Dark Sun campaign setting in 1991 for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition. It's a mix of Tolkienian fantasy and post-apocalyptic themes, and scarcity plays a big part here. But whereas other apocalyptic media like Mad Max focused on a lack of petrol, Dark Sun sees city-states ruled by dominating sources of water and hoarding metals. Enter Athas, where an overexploitation of nature-defiling magic by tyrannical wizards led to a cataclysmic event. Defilers consume the life of plants and animals as the source from which they conjure powerful magic. Over time, greenery shriveled and died. Once fertile soil dried up and cracked for want of water, and sorcery even malformed the nearest star from a bright beacon of light into the scorching red giant known as the Dark Sun, ravaging the lands in unbearable heat, and destined to consume the world in drought and fire. Now, in the eyes of the people, practicing magic violates the natural world. This is ironic because Sorcerer-Kings, the most potent defiler mages, rule most of the cities and settlements left in the wasteland. The world of Athas is a mix of Conan the Barbarian, Spartacus-style arenas, and post-apocalyptic wastelands. Even the races of the land are unusual. There are some familiar faces, standard fantasy fare such as humans, elves, dwarves, half-elves, and halflings, but this time around, Dark Sun introduces you to some unconventional races and classes that fantasy fiction and D&D hadn't explored before. The Mole are an unnatural, sterile hybrid, with the height of humans and the stocky strength and hardiness of dwarves, bred for their fortitude in the Colosseum and the slave pits. Half-giants are massive assets due to their legendary strength and double hit point bonus. They throw walloping blows that can fell monsters in a single hit. Then there's the unsettling Thrycreen, a mantis-like race who cannot use armor, but are specialists in using the Chakacha, their unique throwing weapon. In Athas, your primary goal is to survive rather than thrive. Most of the populace lives in the Tablelands, a flatter part of the world, and though harsh and hardly fertile, it is the most hospitable region of Athas. To the east lies the coastline to the mysterious Sea of Silt, dried up from eons of defiling through magic. And to the northwest, the ringing mountains ward off the region known as the Hinterlands, inhabited by the most deadly of horrors, beyond our imagination. Wanderers would slit your throat for a taste of water or access to a spot of shade. Hard metals like iron are extremely scarce after the apocalypse, so crafters forge most weapons and armor from animal hide or bone. and ceramic pieces act as the currency of the world rather than gold. There are 7 city-states that trade and rule over the tablelands, heavily inspired by Mesopotamia, the Late Bronze Age, and the Early Iron Age. One of the largest of these is the decadent city-state of Tyr, dominated by Templars and the Sorcerer-King. These tyrants keep citizens purposefully illiterate, to further dominate them through ignorance of the governance, accounting, and laws of the land, and slaves outnumber citizens 2 to 1. Those wizards who still try to protect and maintain the sanctity of the world and its scarce flora and fauna are known as preservers, sworn enemies of the defiler mages. People have mutated under the gaze of the Dark Sun, to a point where nearly everyone has developed psionic powers to siphon life, control others' minds, and other psychic abilities. Oil painter Gerald Brom visualized the bleak, invigorating look of Dark Sun. Brom also created works for Doom, Heretic, Diablo 2, and Conan the Barbarian, among others. Dark Sun's artwork is so metal, you swear you can hear the guitar riffs of Manowar just by looking at it. The early to mid-90s was peak D&D. TSR was still an independent company, before Wizards of the Coast bought them in 1997, and before toy giant Hasbro bought WotC in 1999. Today, it remains a strong product brand, but in the 90s, D&D was a lifestyle. The first video game adaptation came out 2 years after the tabletop setting did. Dark Sun Shattered Lands was SSI's new gambit into this fresh setting and a new engine, discarding their old but reliable gold box RPG system, which had served them for years. First up, you can either boldly click Start Game to dig right in with a pre-generated party, or you'll have to click Create Characters to build your team of 4 from scratch. You can choose from the common fantasy races, plus the Dark Sun specific races like Mull, Half-Giant, and Thri-Kreen. The slender races like elves, half-elves, and halflings lean toward dexterity, mental fortitude, and spellcasting. The beefier races like Mull, half-giants, and dwarves are fit for fighters and gladiators. And humans are overall average choices for any class or build. Clerics harness their wisdom to conjure from one of 4 elemental spheres: air, earth, fire, and water. They have healing, defensive, and conjuration spells, as well as the ability to turn undead, a powerful attack against zombies and shadows. Druids can wield all weapons but cannot wear armor, so they rely heavily on magic items, wisdom, and charisma. They also cast cleric spells and have a focus on cosmic sphere magic, but cannot turn undead. Fighters are built for combat. They can wield all weapons and armor, and gain extra speed and attacks at higher levels. Constitution and strength are their primary stats. Gladiators are very similar to fighters, but gain extra benefit from armor at higher levels. They have a slightly slower level progression as a trade-off. Preservers are intelligence-based magic users, allied with nature, and sworn enemies of defiler mages. They gain the least hit points of all classes, and cannot wear armor or use most weapons. They instead wield powerful attack spells, and can summon monsters for aid, comparable to wizards and sorcerers in traditional D&D. As part of the Dark Sun narrative, all characters gain level 1 psionic abilities in a single discipline. Psionicists, however, are specialists who gain all 3 psionic disciplines: psychokinesis, physical object manipulation and attacks, psychometabolism, morphing your own body or stealing life, and telepathy, mental attacks and defenses. Either constitution or wisdom empowers these abilities, and they consume psionic points to use, rather than the spells per day system. Rangers are strength, wisdom, and dexterity focused, specializing in bows and swords, but cannot wear heavy armor. They can, however, cast cleric spells at higher levels. And finally, thieves are dexterity heavy and quick on their feet, preferring to backstab enemies for extra damage. As an added bonus, thieves level up faster than any other class. Then there's the concept of multi-classing, which can confuse newer players. Essentially, you can level up in your starting class, Then begin a second class at level 1 and level that one up as well, gaining abilities from both classes. For example, you could start out as a fighter, then add a couple levels of cleric to become a sort of beefy spellcasting warrior, like a paladin. The story begins with your party as slaves, entering a brutal gladiatorial match, which can easily result in one or more of your characters slain. Resurrection is not available for a while, so this can be punishing, as AD&D often was. If you taunt the arena announcer Maximus style at the start of the game, he will get furious and send even more deadly creatures into the arena to finish you off. You must fight several rounds to gain enough reputation to convince the other prisoners held in the slave pens that you're ready to join in on their escape plan. Then you'll need to traverse the sewers before you're truly free to roam Athas. Similar to later games like Baldur's Gate and Temple of Elemental Evil, Dark Sun can seem overwhelming at first. A couple of unintuitive rules from older D&D pervade here. For example, before 3rd edition D&D, they counted armor class backwards, so the lower your AC was, the better. You'll have to understand how to read dice numbers, and some complicated tabletop mechanics borrowed from D&D proper. For example, a standard 1d6 club deals damage equal to a single 6-sided die, meaning it will roll anywhere from 1 to 6 equally. If you upgrade to the 2d4 spear, you roll the equivalent of 2 4-sided dice, ranging from 2 to 8, with a weighted average. Luckily, the Dark Sun games have separate clue books, which detail locations, items, and game mechanics, which thankfully are included as PDFs in their digital releases. A highly recommended read if you get stuck. Spellcasters have a great advantage in initiating a fight and tilting the odds to your favor with a fireball or an ice storm, but are limited in their spells they can cast per spell level every day. It's difficult to tell how many spells per day you have remaining, right up until you can't cast them anymore. You can restore your spells per day, your psionic points, and your hit points by resting at a fire pit, but these aren't always readily available. The game has difficulty modes, but your party build is arguably even more important in terms of challenge. Squishy spellcasters, thieves, and rangers can get crushed in a single round if unprotected, whereas a party full of tanky, half-giant fighters and gladiators is basically easy mode. If you're having trouble getting through the game, half-giant fighter psionicist hybrids and gladiators will steamroll most battles. Offense can be your best defense, so dual-wielding a weapon in each hand is a great option for fighter-type characters. The gods of Athas have forsaken their people after defilers killed the world with their greed and malicious use of magic. For this reason, resurrection is nigh impossible, and so it's very easy to lose a character in battle, permanently. The good thing, though, is that your characters and party are easily interchangeable. You can drop any party member at will, living or not, which transfers them into a character pool. You can then fill that slot with a brand new character build, or you can import a character dropped from another save game. This is a fun way to make crossovers of your favorite heroes. It's also an effective way to cheat death for cutting players, as you're able to load old save games and drop characters from there, essentially creating backups.
Welcome back to the Dark Sun world.
A year later, SSI followed the first game up with Wake of the Ravager. The original came on both floppy disk and CD format, but both versions were the exact same game. However, the sequel got some significant upgrades if you had a CD-ROM drive. Voice-acted dialogue now accompanies some sequences. There's a 3D rendered intro, as well as CD-quality music, compared to the MIDI tunes of the first game. Wake of the Ravager has a much shorter runway to open-world gameplay than its predecessor. If you only have the time or patience to play one of these titles, Ravager is the more polished and accessible of the two. Unlike Shattered Lands, which benefited from having a hardened, melee-focused team of fighters, the higher starting level in Wake of the Ravager means that spellcasters get a lot more powerful magic right from the get-go, and so are much more viable here. The sequel begins in the Babylonian city of Tyr, with a vast bazaar full of traders, all under the watchful eyes of the vengeful Templars. Here you can speak to the paranoid citizens for trade or quests, who wish for nothing but to look the other way while murder and corruption abound. Your party is witness to a brutal killing, and eventually gets entangled in a plot involving the secret society known as the Veiled Alliance. The recently vacated seat of the Sorcerer-King of Tyr created a power vacuum. Ruminations of a wicked mastermind known only as the Dragon emerge, and everyone scrambles for scraps. Wake of the Ravager lets you play with higher level characters, so naturally, the combat is going to be more advanced and interesting. It's also a much more urban-focused adventure, with less free-roam exploration than the first outing, but immersing yourself in the world of Athas is a mesmerizing experience. Mistrustful and devious denizens rarely speak their true intentions. You must learn a secret door knock pattern in order to be led into a restricted area. Malevolent plots threaten to plunge the remnants of the world into an even darker age. All the while, you must survive the bloodthirsty monsters and inhospitable terrain of the wasteland. Both Shattered Lands and Wake of the Ravager were unfinished and buggy at launch. SSI fixed some crashes and glitches with patches, a rare thing back in the day, but digital downloads of the game today enjoy these updates pre-installed. The multiplayer-only follow-up, Dark Sun Online: Crimson Sands, released 2 years after Wake of the Ravager. The game featured online chat and nearly unrestrained player-versus-player combat, but hacking and exploits were rampant due to most of the game's logic being processed by local computers rather than servers by design. The game's short-lived online service, Total Entertainment Network, folded shortly after, ending the game's brief outing in 1999, just as players greeted MMOs like Ultima Online and EverQuest with open arms. For a 1993 game, Dark Sun Shattered Lands was ahead of its time. It tackled the advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules from a tactical view and proved that they could execute it well, nearly 5 years before the original Baldur's Gate. The game also incorporated thorough support of the mouse, with right-clicks toggling through move, attack, ranged, and speak or interact actions, similar to 1997's Fallout. You can left-click the ever-present sun icon to the top left to get into your character screen, or right-click it to pull up the quick psionic and spellcasting menu, and tab is your go-to hotkey for pulling up your menu, for saving, inventory, and all other options. Gameplay and animations are bound to the CPU, so the faster your computer, the faster the game plays out. The emulator necessary to play the game, DOSBox, tries to regulate this, but there are times the action zips by at lightning speed, or gameplay slows to a crawl when a bunch of characters or spell effects are on screen. 3 decades of gameplay and UI enhancements haven't flattered the Dark Sun games, but the interface is intuitive enough, with brief descriptions available by right-clicking items and spells. There are also hotkeys for nearly every menu and screen, so pro players can cut to the chase if need be. The sandy seas of Dark Sun are not for the faint of heart. With its roots firmly planted in hardcore, advanced D&D, and a post-apocalyptic setting to boot, you're in for some whiplash. Characters don't magically stand up after being mortally wounded in a fight. Overwhelming odds are common, and some of the tabletop mechanics assume familiarity with the pen and paper game, and they didn't seamlessly translate into the digital realm, like the more accessible Diablo-like games or Divinity Original Sin. But for those who have the patience to see it through, the Dark Sun games can be incredibly rewarding and unconventional. They are a rare digital gateway into one of the greatest fantasy settings ever designed. I hope that in some small way, this video helps ensure that the Dark Sun setting and the video games it inspired will never be forgotten. Thanks for watching.